Welcome to the latest NERI webinar on the living wage. My name is Christopher Barry. I'm a Senior Policy Officer at the Greater London Authority, where I work within the Mayor of London's Economic Fairness team. I recently completed my Master's at SOAS University of London, where my dissertation focused on why Irish and South African policymakers should consider introducing the living wage and some of the pathways to achieving that. Also here today is Robert Thornton. He's a Senior Research Policy Officer at the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice, and he's also a member of the Irish Living Wage Technical Group. So thanks for coming along today as well, Robert.
Thank you.
So what does Adam Smith, Aristotle, Plato, Karl Marx, FDR, and the Pope have in common, other than unwittingly being name dropped on NERI's latest webinar? Well, the answer is for various economic, social, political, philosophical, and religious reasons, they all believed in the concept of the living wage. Long-standing interest in the living wage is proof that this is not a new or radical policy, but wage floors and their various impacts remains one of the most contested topics in economic policy. A living wage is another form of wage floor, which attempts to reduce inequality and poverty, but unlike the minimum wage, the primary concern is the cost of living for workers in various regions and countries. Ultimately, a living wage aims to raise the standard of living for workers by ensuring a basic set of needs are met. And that point's really, really important. It is only a basic set of needs. This isn't an extravagant lifestyle. This is a modest one at best. And Robert will delve into what that really means. So what's the kind of context in Ireland? On paper, Ireland has the second highest minimum wage in the EU, but when that's adjusted for the purchasing power index, that actually only reduces it to the seventh highest. Ireland's tax system plays an important role in reducing inequality in the country, but part of the reason that's needed is because market income inequality, i.e. before government taxes and transfers, is one of the highest again in the EU. Also, for every category of worker in Ireland, be that full-time or part-time, they saw an increase in material deprivation between 2005 and 2017. So that was even before the pandemic. And while Irish GDP hasn't fallen off a cliff, partly as a result of income protection schemes such as the PUP, Irish low-paid workers are most likely to have lost their jobs and suffer from reduced hours in low-paid sectors such as tourism, accommodation, and hospitality. And as per Kieran Nugent's most recent report on the labour market, young people, and particularly young women, look like most likely to have suffered as a result, highlighting that maybe, again, we're not all in this together. On a macro level, multilateral institutions such as the EU and IMF have spoken about building back better and avoiding maybe some of the mistakes of the previous decade, given low-wage workers' higher propensity to consume. Introducing a living wage is one way of potentially introducing a demand-led recovery. And it's within this context that the current Irish government have said that they'd like to introduce a living wage within the lifetime of this government. Now, naturally, some employers and their representative groups are against such increases during recessionary times, as we find ourselves again today. But another reason why the living wage is sometimes rejected is because it's too complicated and that there's no figure exists. But as Robert will now explain, we do have a figure in Ireland, and you might be so kind as to explain some of the methodology behind that.
Okay. I'll just share my screen now. 1 second. Here we go. Yep. So, thanks for that. I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we mean by the living wage, how we calculate the rate, and the evidence which provides the basis for the calculation. And I'll also have a look at how the rate has changed from when we first calculated it in 2014 to the most recent figure from September of last year. So the living wage is based on the concept that work should provide an adequate income to enable individuals to live with dignity, to afford a socially acceptable minimum standard of living, and take part in normal day-to-day activities. In this way, it represents an earnings floor. It's a rate of pay which allows employees afford the essentials needed for a life with dignity. And so earning below this level suggests employees are forced to do without certain essentials so that they can make ends meet. So the living wage rate is a simple answer to a complex question. What do people need to earn in order to have an acceptable minimum standard of living? And the Vincentian partnerships minimum essential standard of living research provides an evidence-based measure for assessing the minimum income need of households. And so this data underpins the calculation of the living wage rate in Ireland. So this budget standards research identifies the cost of what's required to enable a life with dignity at a minimum but acceptable level, what we call the minimum essential standard of living, or MESL. It represents a standard that no one should be expected to live below, and which meets physical, psychological, and social needs at a minimum but acceptable level. And the use of budget standards or reference budgets research has been growing internationally, and the Essential Partnerships MESL work is recognised at EU level and beyond. In Ireland, we use the well-established consensual budget standards methodology. So this approach works with members of the public to reach agreement on the minimum needed to live and partake in the social and economic norms of life in contemporary Ireland. We do this through working with multiple phases of deliberative focus groups. So here, in-depth discussions take place, each building on the work of the previous stage to ultimately produce a negotiated consensus on what people regard as essential. The research places an emphasis on needs, not wants, and produces a comprehensive, transparent, itemized list of 2,000 goods and services, detailing what's required to meet minimum needs and enable this acceptable minimum standard of living. So the MESL research establishes a practical and tangible benchmark. It provides a workable definition of what's needed to meet the human right to an adequate standard of living, the European Pillar of Social Rights commitment to an adequate income for a life with dignity, and it reflects the concepts which underpin official government definitions of poverty and social inclusion. So the MESL budget standards research translates these concepts into a practical measure. It establishes the average weekly cost of the basket of goods and services that people have agreed are essential for a minimum but socially acceptable standard of living. And so this provides a unique evidence-based reference point of what constitutes a minimally adequate income for a life with dignity, shining a light on what's needed to avoid poverty and enable participation and inclusion. So back in 2013, the Essential Partnership began exploratory work examining the application of the MESL data to the question of the living wage rate. And we looked at different approaches that were taken to calculating the rate. And as a proof of concept, we investigated the UK model as it was at that time. We published these findings at the start of 2014, and subsequently the Living Wage Technical Group was established. This group worked to produce an agreed method which was evidence-based, robust, practical, and transparent. And ultimately, the group decided to focus the calculation of the Irish living wage on a single adult household, as this provided the most robust and practical approach to calculating the rate in a transparent manner. So the living wage for Ireland then is the average hourly salary a single person in full-time employment needs to afford a minimum acceptable standard of living across the country. But we also recognise that family households with children have additional and different needs. And we demonstrate these in a set of family living income calculations, which are produced in conjunction with the living wage rate each year. Because wages alone can't address these additional needs. Social supports need to work in conjunction with the earnings floor, which is represented by the living wage, to address the additional needs of households with children. This could be through addressing childcare costs, income support such as working family payment, and so on, and thereby enable an acceptable minimum standard of living. So to calculate the living wage rate, we use the MESL data for a working age single adult living alone without dependents. And as minimum expenditure need varies across the country, we need to look at 4 regions. We look at the Dublin area, comprised of the city, suburbs, and other towns in the county area. We look at the city and suburbs of the other cities of Cork, Galway, Limerick, and Waterford. Towns then, which is all towns in the country with a population of over 5,000, excluding any of those that would have been included in the city and suburb areas above. And finally, rural areas, which we classify as towns and villages with a population of under 5,000 and all other rural areas. We found the most significant areas of difference between these regions are in housing and transport. So in the living wage calculations, housing costs are based on living in private rented accommodation, and we use the RTP data to inform the calculations. So we calculate a weighted average rent for a 1-bed dwelling in each of these 4 regions, and we base the housing costs and the calculations on 90% of this average. So in the 2020-2021 living wage calculations, Rent made up between a quarter to slightly over half of total minimum expenditure needs, with a national average of 40% of minimum living costs for a single adult going on rent. For transport, the costs are based on the use of public transport in the city regions, but with limited public transport in other areas, a car is regarded as an essential item. So for the city, the prices are based on the weekly or monthly leap card fares for the city bus service. And in town and rural areas, the transport costs are based on the use of a small car, including the purchasing, running, and maintenance for the vehicle. Having established the overall cost of a minimum standard of living in each of these 4 regions, we then calculate the minimum gross salary that would be needed to meet this cost in each region. And then to produce the national rate, we calculate the average salary needed across the country by weighting it by the proportion of the labour force in each area. And from there, we can produce an hourly rate that will provide this average salary based on the assumption of a 39-hour full-time week. The living wage rate then is updated annually. This ensures that it keeps track of changes in minimum living costs. The minimum living costs are adjusted for changes in price and to take account of any changes in services which may have an impact on living costs, such as a change in medical card thresholds or public transport fares, for example. Changes in the tax payable on the living wage salary will also have an effect, and it's important to remember the rate can go up or down. So to date, the living wage rate has increased from €11.45 when first calculated in 2014 to the current rate of €12.30 per hour. Over this period, there have been fluctuations in the costs of different aspects of the minimum basket, with some areas rising, such as clothing and transport costs, and other areas reducing, such as food. But there have been consistent increases in housing costs each year. There's also been a reduction in the universal social charge payable at the living wage level, and this offsets some of the need for a higher rate to meet increases in minimum living costs. So the living wage rate for Ireland has increased by 7.4% since first calculated in 2014. In the same period, however, average earnings in the private sector have increased by a higher rate, almost 16%, and the minimum wage has increased by 17.9%. So just to wrap up, the living wage rate is based on the idea that work should provide an adequate income to enable individuals to live with dignity. It's an evidence-based rate of pay. It's calculated on the basis of robust data, which is the product of research on what's required for a socially acceptable minimum standard of living. The living wage rate is calculated on the basis of the minimum living costs for a single adult, and it's based on the assumption of full-time work, and the rate is the average required across the country. The calculation method is transparent, and it's detailed in documents available on the Living Wage website, livingwage.ie. The rate's updated annually to ensure it keeps track of changes in minimum living costs, and the rate can go up or down. The annual update is published in the third quarter of each year to provide adequate notice of any change in the rate for both employees and employers for the year to come. That's me done. Thank you.
I guess just the first question I'd have was just thinking about that adequate income, and maybe if you could kind of delve a little bit deeper into some of the demographics that would be earning below the kind of the living wage in Ireland, and maybe some of the differences between how the minimum wage is calculated and the living wage that you guys produce.
Yeah, and I suppose in terms of who's earning below the living wage, I think in 2020, there was about 25% of workers were earning below the living wage, about 20% of full-time workers. Within that, I mean, I'm not as familiar with the demographics as some others would be, but I mean, I think that the usual groups that tend to be in the lower paid, precarious work, low paid work, minimum wage work, or in this case below the living wage, it tends to be younger workers, part-time workers, women, migrants, those groups that are more at risk of being in this category. Sorry, what was your second question?
And it was just about the differences between how the minimum wage is calculated.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so currently the minimum wage rate is determined by or recommended by the Low Pay Commission, which is made up of representatives from different sectors, employers, employee, trade union side, and others. And in a sense, it has a range of criteria that they're meant to consider. They consider the impact on business. They consider there is a nod towards the needs of living costs and needs of employees, but it is more a wider kind of economic consideration that they seem to take. And there's not an explicit calculation methodology. So in that sense, it is I wouldn't go as far to say it's arbitrary, but there's not a clear benchmark of what the minimum wage is based on. The current rate is 10.20 an hour. When we started calculating the living wage in 2014, the minimum wage was 8.65 an hour. So I mean, it has gone up significantly over that period, but there's still a notable gap between the living wage and the minimum wage. And that's not an evidence-based rate of pay. I think that's the fundamental difference. It's not really tied to living costs or a standard of living.
Right. What do you think is incentivizing the government to considering moving towards the living wage? And then I suppose that point you were making about the various stakeholders who were involved in the minimum wage. ep12 pulled out last year because they felt the increase was inadequate. So I'm just kind of interested in that context during a pandemic as well, when that the government are considering this. Yeah,
it's an interesting one. It's hard to know. I mean, it makes a part of the program for government. His commitment to move towards a living wage, and the Low Pay Commission have been given the terms of reference to start looking into that. What would living wage mean? That doesn't mean they're automatically adopting the work of the living wage technical group and the calculation that I've just been discussing. And so they're looking at what they regard as appropriate to be on a more statutory footing. The motivation is it's hard to know. I mean, one would hope that some of it has come from maybe this idea that has come during the pandemic, that putting more value on seeing this idea of frontline workers, lower paid sectors that have been those that had to keep going to work when so many of us were sitting at home, the people in shops and services and so forth, and also done those sectors that were hardest hit, those that were shuttered and were out of work. That could be one aspect of it. I suppose the other is perhaps that kind of economic thinking of, if we move towards a more adequate living wage and an evidence-based minimum wage that gets closer to an appropriate earnings floor, where there's perhaps less burden on the state then to provide social supports to make up for that gap. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure what the motivation is. I wouldn't have previously expected Leo Varadkar to be the one making a push towards a living wage. So, but he's a politician that surprises you, so you never know.
For sure. I mean, yeah. some of the UK context and precedent on this is quite interesting, because in 2015, unknown to the Low Pay Commission in the UK, George Osborne announced that he was introducing a minimum living wage, which set alarm bells ringing that this was going to be something quite radical. But it turned out to be an empty promise in many ways, because I suppose the term living wage is essentially just a concept and a term that can be used, but ultimately, and as you've gone through, it's the methodology that really matters on this. So that, if the thought shouldn't being willing to surprise you, there's an element where I fear slightly that the term could be hijacked, like it was in the UK, because again, the context in the UK was that the Living Wage Foundation in the UK, they calculate the living wage nationally, and in London, they also accredit employers who voluntarily pay it. But they've had to slightly rebrand the term and say the real living wage, because that's based on a similar methodology that you've outlined.
Yeah, and that would be a concern. I mean, I suppose I would have some familiarity with the UK situation. All right. The UK living wage rate, as I'm sure you know, is calculated on the basis of very similar research to the minimum standard research we do here. And we liaise with that research team from Loughborough a lot. So beware of their involvement in it, and then also this, like you say, this kind of almost co-opting of the living wage term by the government to kind of rebrand the minimum wage. And so, as you say, the Living Wage Foundation had to kind of start talking about the real living wage. The only thing I suppose I would give some hope that that's not the avenue we're pursuing here is how, as this was announced, this was the interest in the living wage here on an official level. The Taoiseach has he has acknowledged the work of the technical group and the potential partnership and the MESL research as informing that. That doesn't mean he's also raised flagged concerns around particularly to do with the housing costs that are incorporated in the living wage. And some of the discussion, I think, that's come from the Low Pay Commission so far has kind of also raised some of those questions about basing the living wage on private rented costs as opposed to some other housing costs. The issue there, I suppose, really comes down to, while yes, the living wage in Ireland is being very much driven up by rents and the ongoing rise in rents, but that's the reality that's on the ground. That is, the minimum living costs include rent, and currently, there isn't a wide availability of kind of below cost rental available to kind of single working age adults who are in full-time employment, which is what the living wage is calculated on the basis of. So in the sense that if there's a significant deviation in some proposed formula from reality as such, the lived experience of people who are going to be earning this wage, then it's not really going to be a living wage. So that would be the concern, certainly. Yeah.
And then, I mean, again, some of the UK context on this is that the current Tory administration have said that they want to move towards the minimum wage being 60% of median income by 2024. Now, that was a pre-pandemic promise, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But that 60% number has come up a lot. So the EU have a proposed directive that minimum wage in all EU countries would move towards kind of that using the KITES index, kind of 60% of median income. But what I found quite interesting is that some of the countries resisting it are the Nordic countries. Mm-hmm. So the Nordic countries have strong collective bargaining in place, and that's reflective of the fact that the living wage is a really strong and popular concept in Anglo-Saxon economies. Joe Biden has promised a $15 living wage. It's a prominent topic in the UK. It's prominent in Ireland. But why do you think Anglo-Saxon economies, the living wage is such a kind of more popular term there compared to the maybe more collective bargaining based economies and social systems as the Nordics?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I think you've kind of given a hint at an answer in your question. I mean, I think it is those countries that have that strong bargaining, have that strong social supports, that this idea of a living wage isn't perhaps as necessary. It's not that they don't have poverty and in-work poverty and low pay, but the level of protection and the mechanisms to address it are much stronger there, compared to ourselves, which are high rates of low pay in Ireland, but the UK and other Anglo-Saxon sort of liberal economies, whether New Zealand has a strong living wage campaign going as well. Parts of Canada have it too. So there's that kind of I suppose it seems to be the English-speaking world, and that group of countries that all come from that same influence have a shared set of problems and approaches to addressing those problems, which generally seem to focus on, how would you put it? I suppose non-state action in a way. So it's the sense that it's the individual's responsibility, and then I suppose campaigning and encouraging employers to voluntarily pay a better wage, and then kind of give them a badge they can put on their website or their premises or whatever to show that they do, and then encourage individuals to shop with those. It's that kind of ground up approach as opposed to a top down approach seems to be favored quite broadly. which is interesting. I think there was a Eurofound, one of the EU agencies there a couple of years ago. They did a piece of work looking at kind of moves towards a living wage across Europe and such. And really, I happened to be asked to attend a meeting about it. And outside of Ireland and the UK at the time, because it was pre-Brexit, other European countries didn't really have living wage. They had, like you say, bargaining and discussion, and it was trade union representatives at this meeting as well from some of the Central European countries. But the idea of a living wage, other than this kind of notion that wages should be adequate, and that was something that they were arguing for, but this sort of idea of this kind of campaign, ground up campaign, just wasn't something that really registered with them. And I suppose there was almost a loss in translation kind of thing. They understood the words, they didn't understand that wider context that we were getting at. So it was interesting in that sense that it's not something that's really taking off in other countries. I suppose it comes back as well to somewhat like the countries that in a sense don't even have a minimum wage are also those countries that in a sense maybe least need it, because they have, like you say, all those strong systems to ensure a better level of protection, a better level of pay for people.
Yeah, and Germany is quite an interesting example of that, where they collective bargained for years and kind of resisted minimum wage, and then introduced it a couple of years ago. And Germany's a really interesting example because naturally everyone's, economists have taken a huge interest in this. I mentioned that this is one of the most kind of contested topics within economics. Classical had the competitive price model and said, it'll naturally lead to unemployment. And that's the point I wanted to come to next, which is about the kind of big key stakeholder in this is employers and their representative groups. Because in Ireland, going back right the way to the introduction of the minimum wage in 1999, employer group representative groups, I would argue, have cried wolf a little bit on this, where they've said this is going to have detrimental impacts on employment, and in reality, based on increases that maybe haven't been adequate enough or haven't been over the top, there's little proof that level of employment has happened to any great extent. So I guess I'm curious if we're moving towards a living wage and including employers, which kind of seems to go against the definition of a living wage, what's their role within this? How can they be appeased, and how can they be convinced that this is good for them and potentially as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, I suppose. It depends on the employer sometimes. I mean, there are those employers already in Ireland that say they're paying the living wage, and we don't have an accreditation system like there is in the UK. It's not official, but they say they're paying the living wage. I assume they're not lying, and I assume they are well intentioned when they say that. But I suppose there are several big recognizable kind of retail chains, and then a number of other smaller companies and organizations, and a few other sort of, how would I say, corporate entities, and maybe not quite so much of a household name, but that people would be vaguely aware of. But outside of that, it hasn't really been a big discussion. And then you have the employer representative groups. So each year when the technical group produce our updated figure, they will critique it in one way or another. Now, the critique has gotten less robust in recent years, so perhaps they're saying that the approach needs to change. But even there, it depends. So say the Restaurants Federation group will always be very negative on anything we produce, and the ISME, the Small and Medium Enterprises group, that they are less robustly negative, but still not very much in favour of it. Whereas IBEC, who represents the bigger employers, have gotten less vociferous in their approach to discussions on the living wage. Not saying they're rowing in behind it, but they're not, obviously against either. So I suppose perhaps that shows those sectors that are most engaged in lower pay and are already going to would face the bigger impact of a move towards the living wage, are the ones that are continuing to express most concern. And it's a it's a complicated one. I don't, there seem to be those sectors where low pay is so embedded in it. It's not just, it's a broader question, I suppose, in a sense, than just the living wage, in terms of what is it about those sectors that has made them so that low pay so pernicious in those sectors compared to others, and why in Ireland compared to other countries, for example, restaurants seem to be particularly vulnerable to low pay here, but maybe not in other European countries. So why is that? I don't know. I'm not, that's out of my field of expertise, but you would wonder, and that's probably the big challenge then, is those types of sectors which have such a concentration of lower pay, probably primarily in and around the minimum wage, how would they move towards this living wage? Of course, the other side of it then is, with living costs driving up the living wage to such a degree, part of the solution probably has to be looking at those living costs and what can be done on a more, at a state level, a government level, and policy response to address those high living costs, particularly housing, but transport would be part of it too, for example, and so thereby reduce what the living wage rate actually is. If the living costs could be addressed, then that could bring down the rate to be something more approachable for some of those smaller employers to consider paying too. So perhaps it's not fair to put all the burden on the small employer either.
That's true. And I think governments in the past, particularly post 2008, was good examples of France using employment subsidies to keep people in the workforce. And maybe there might be sectors that might qualify for that. But as I was explaining, my dissertation, I also looked at South Africa and the possibility of an implementation of the living wage there. But South Africa maybe have the worst example of this, is where employers can simply apply to be exempt from paying the minimum wage full stop. So in that case, it's the worker that loses out rather than some kind of form of subsidy for the state. And I think that point you were making about additional policies is really interesting. And obviously one that I think is critical in so many levels is childcare as well, because this has been a very gendered impact recession and the impact on the labour market. I think that's clear. I mentioned Kieran Nugent's report, but it's also kind of the same anywhere. Even when people are working from home, people are taking up kind of additional care. So I think getting women back into the workforce, childcare, is also kind of a critical piece that needs to be addressed. I just want to talk about some of those low pay workers and returning to the workforce, because there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence in the media about workers staying on PUP, avoiding going back to work. What does some of the data tell us? Is that really happening on the ground? Are workers not returning to work? And also, is there a role for a living wage to incentivize people to come back as well?
I don't know what the data tells us, actually. I haven't been looking, so I really couldn't comment. I suppose there's probably multiple, but it strikes me in a lot of that discourse, I do wonder how much of it is true, to what extent people aren't going back to work. But then also, just because the employer has suddenly been able to reopen in their particular sector doesn't mean the employee is in a position to perhaps go back. There are a whole range of factors about why people may or may not be able to go back and maybe staying in PUP, and that to date some of those well, the PUP is winding down soon. To date, those have been valid. If your childcare, for instance, wasn't available because of the pandemic, you're able to stay on the PUP payment even if your job had reopened. So there are those kind of things too. So it's I think it's more complicated than some of the media commentary has implied. But then, like you say as well, there is probably a question of if the work that was on offer was better paid, then that would perhaps incentivize things. But I suppose I'm cautious about saying that, because I think some of the commentary around the PUP and people not returning to work or staying on it has sort of suggested that the PUP is too high, and people, it should be reduced to force people back to work. So I suppose the other side of that coin is saying that the wage is too low, but I would feel there are probably other factors at play than just the wage and the PUP rate overall. In part at least because I suppose to continue to qualify for the PUP, you have to show why you're not able to return to work if your job is there, kind of thing. So I don't think it can just be the economics of it, like the household economics. But I'm not sure beyond that.
I think one of the issues I've kind of seen with discussions on wage floors is that they are too binary and they're too focused on economics, and there is that moral case of saying, has work just been undervalued for so long? But also there's a lot of psychological studies around the value of the living wage and what that means in terms of your kind of own personal freedom, about kind of drawing on the kind of capability approach, but also what it means to maybe further yourself and do extra study and have some of that time back for yourself as well. So I would definitely stress that economics shouldn't be only considered because earning and going to work is much more of that. And then having just said that, probably my final question is just around kind of the future of work and how the living wage operates within this, because in Ireland we saw the 4-day campaign launched. In the UK, this is a big point at the moment, but greater levels of self-employment, and also tied with that is flexibility, is also a lot of insecurity as well. So I just want you just maybe to think about the future where the pandemic has changed, that we're all working from home now. We'll be moving to a hybrid working model for a lot of people. So what's the role of a living wage when you consider that the 39-hour week? If we move to more of the 4-day, how does that work with self-employment? I'd just be interested for your take on that.
Yeah, I suppose fundamentally the living wage, we presented as an hourly figure, that 39-hour week to get to that hourly figure. But ultimately, it's about what are the minimum living costs, and then what salary do you need to get to those. So I mean, we start with a number. What's the living cost for the year? And then, so what's the gross salary you need for that? And then we divide it by the weeks and divide that by the hours. So if that standard formula of days worked and hours worked was to change, well then the formula in a sense to get to the final number would change. So when we say the living wage rate is $12.30 an hour, that's really just because when we talk about low pay, people talk about the minimum wage, and it's sort of the standard comparison, the hourly rate. But really, I mean, the living wage is €478 a week, or it's 25,000 per annum. That's the end goal, to get people to that level, and that's what would enable this minimum standard of living. But obviously with precarious work and a gig economy and all of these things, so many people don't have that standard. And that is I suppose is a wider question about how, as work is continued, is changing. I mean, that was before the pandemic, and the pandemic may well accelerate that change, or may not. I suppose we don't know right now, in that sense, do we? It's hard to know what's going to come of those things. We see the sort of talk about how retail workers and the people and the delivery people that brought our takeaways or delivered our Amazon packages or whatever else should be treated better and rewarded better and paid better and have better terms and conditions and such. Whether we'll continue to talk about that or whether that'll really happen remains to be seen. We can only hope. But in all this talk of new normals and all the rest, it seems there's lots of aspirational talk until it comes time to actually be real, and then we're back to the old normal. So it's hard to know, but as we continue, that is an ongoing issue with the living wage. We produce this hourly rate, but it's only really a living wage when people have living hours, which I think is a campaign they're starting to talk about in the UK, that people should have adequate hours to earn that final figure per week, or at least have the option to have them, because not everyone wants or can work full time, but has the option to have them. And then security of employment and all of it. But I suppose the living wage is not the panacea to everything. It is part of the answer. Is kind of our figure informs kind of where that earnings floor sits. Other aspects then are the quality of the work and the security of the work and the adequacy of the hours available and so on.
I think yeah, that's absolutely nailed on, and Another point around it is the enforcement of living wages too. So Ireland has gotten in trouble before with kind of the International Transport Workers Union around migrant fishers and farmers as well. So I think you're absolutely correct. If the living wage is being introduced, it can only do so much if there aren't complementary policies that are also in place. Thanks everyone for listening. Please check out NERI's Twitter, subscribe to the email, and look at the next webinar series.